Hey guys, Into the End here, back for another video. Now, typically in the first half of the month, we take a fun idea and we make some kind of a gimmicky, janky brew and try to make it competitive. But unfortunately for this month, we already did that. We did that at the end of last month. We made a janky deck into a fairly competitive one in Moment of Creation. For those of you who missed the deck tech and the gameplay videos, please do check my YouTube channel and check this deck out. This deck is actually very fun to play and very powerful. But because we did that at the end of last month, I ran out of gimmicky ideas to explore. So instead, I just made a new deck, a new version of Rakano Plate, a much bigger and later version of it. Uh, One of my friends told me that he saw Lights Out Ace play something kind of like this. I actually didn't see the video. I don't know what his deck list looks like. Supposedly he streamed it and played some games, but I'm not aware of what his deck looks like. I made this on my own, and I think there are some differences from what I've been told. So this is the the deck that I'm using, and I'm currently in Diamond 1, most of the way to Masters already. I was really bored this season, so I just played a bunch of games. I think the main decks that I used for this climb was this Rakano list, and also my Moment of Creation deck from the previous month, and also played a little bit of Armory. In fact, playing Armory and losing with Armory is the reason why I started building this Rakano list. It started out to be a two-color Armory deck, but the more I played, the more I realized I didn't need this to be an Armory deck, and I don't want it to be. Initially, it had 4 Swords of Icaria, 4 Rune Hammers, 2 Daishos, and 4 Rakano Artisans to buff them. But the more I played, the more I realized that the deck works really well without the weapons. And so this is the current version of the deck. It's a it's actually a mid to late game deck, despite it looking pretty aggressive. And really, it turns out that I win the majority of my games by playing Icaria. I started with 1 copy in the deck, and then throughout testing, I went to 2 copies, and then 3 copies, and finally, I just put in all 4 copies. And I even run 4 copies of Rise to the challenge, and majority of the time I do just go ahead and search for Icaria anyway. So it's almost like running 8 copies of Icaria in this deck. It turns out when you play Icaria and then you slap a Deep Forge plate onto it, the vast majority of the decks out there will lose to it or will just simply concede. Especially because you have a lot of decent early game threads. So by the time you have 7 power and play Icaria, your opponent's removal spells would have been exhausted anyway. And a lot of the ways to kill Icaria is using weapons. So if you can survive 1 turn and slap a plate onto it, or if it has a couple of Warcry triggers onto itself, once you dodge Auric Rune Hammers that are 6/1, and if you can dodge Predatory Tyrannosaurs that are 6 power, so if you have more than 6 health, typically speaking, I find that the decks can no longer kill her. So it's a very powerful game finisher. So let's go through some of the cards here. Seek Power in Roland's favor is just you need to play more power sources to get to your 7 drops, and I find that 7 extra power sources, making it a total of 32, is often good enough. There's games where I do get stuck on 6 power and couldn't play Icaria, but it doesn't happen too much. I think playing more power sources risks getting power flooded in this deck. So I think right now, 4 Seek Power and 3 Roland's favor is working okay for me. Those numbers can be tweaked later on. 4 Torch is self-explanatory. 4 Vanquish is really important. You actually don't have a lot of ways to deal with opposing very large units, and the Vanquishes are absolutely critical to the deck, and you really need to save the Vanquishes when you draw them to use it on very large problematic threats that your opponent may have. Tavert, for example, is one of those threats. Typically speaking, if a unit has less than 4 health, you typically just want to save the Vanquish and wait until you can deal with it with a unit by blocking, or simply killing it with a Rune Hammer. Or maybe torching it plus a block. Copperhaw Bailiff is bit of an all-star in this deck in the sense that this deck is pretty slow, as you can see from the curve. There's not a lot of turn 2 plays. In fact, all of your turn 2 plays are not things that can impact the board on turn 2. Because your chances are your opponent won't have a unit you can vanquish on turn 2. And Roland's Favor just gets you a power. So really you just have 4 torch to do in the first 2 turns. And this deck's quite slow. So you do kind of have to depend on drawing some of these to slow your opponent down when you're playing against aggressive decks. The good news is Copperhall Bailiff is amazing against Stone Scar aggro and Skycrag aggro. It's an adequate blocker. It'll trade with anything they have. It'll force them to use one of their burn spells, and it reduces a lot of power on your opponent's side. So I think this card is an all-star in this deck, and Warcry triggers are very good. For any of you who has ever played a 8/8 Deforged Plate or a 7/7 Icaria or a buffed Daisho, the Warcry triggers are very welcome. In fact, even having Warcry triggers on a Spirit Guide is really good against most decks. Iljin, the Imperial Armor, you don't see this deck around. You don't see this card in a lot of decks, but in this deck it's pretty good. I've been really liking it. It's basically a lightning rod in the first 3 turns if you play it. It's gonna get torched, it's gonna get slayed, whatever. It's gonna die. So that's perfectly okay. Trading a 3-power unit with one of your opponent's removal spells, that's perfectly acceptable. But when it really shines is late game staying power. If you draw this card, if you top deck this card on turn 7 or 8 when you have 7 power in play, it's just amazing. You put a +4/+4 on any one of your other units, you almost instantly stabilize the board. And if you happen to be lucky enough to put that +4/+4 onto a Throne Warden or an Icaria, then they're basically 9 killable. And if you put it onto a Spirit Guide, 7/7 lifesteal is enough to basically claw your way back into most games, even if you have fallen quite far behind. Between life steal from the Spirit Guide and whatever student it may give it to, plus the Throne Wardens in this deck actually, and also just the passive sort of quote-unquote life gain from the Roland's Favor is very powerful. It gives this deck a lot of staying power. It has a way to come back once you've fallen behind against aggressive decks. So it's very effective. Once again, most of the time this card will just die when you play it, but once you play it in the mid game, it's a must answer that your opponent has to kill. And I find that when you play aggressive decks like this, or maybe not super aggressive, but mid range, more on the aggressive side, the more must answer threats you have, the more it will exhaust your opponent's removal spells and answers. So the more of these things you put into play, the more likely it is that your late game bombs will survive as well. So pretty good inclusion. Spirit Guide is kind of a concession to the currently very aggressive meta. I play a lot of I play against a lot of aggressive decks, and the Spirit Guide is kind of necessary because you don't do anything for the first 2 turns. You need your turn 3 play to be somewhat impactful. Basically, the Bailiff, Armor, and Guide and Enforcers, between those, you have 15 copies of cards that they pretty much have to torch right away or remove right away, and nobody plays 15 burn spells or 15 removal spells in their deck, right? So chances are 1 or 2 copies of these will stick around, and if any one of these stick around, you really halt the aggressiveness and the tempo of the early game aggressive decks. Runehammer and Daisho, these are my only 4 weapons. They are really good tutor targets for Rise to the Challenge. If you don't have 7 power, Rise to the Challenge on a Runic Hammer here makes it a 6/1, and 6/1 can kill most things that you want to kill. Anything that has Aegis specifically, you can kill with 6 power, 6 attack. So it's a very good combo. There are many games where I rise to the challenge a hammer and kill a champion of cunning, for example, and it just turns the game around. So it's just a very effective removal spell, often result in a card advantage. And in an empty board against slow control decks, these things you can just play and start hitting your opponent for 4 turn, and that will close out games very quickly as well. So it's a very good card. 1 copy of Furnace Mage is just nothing more than a tutor target for Rise to the Challenge. It's come in handy quite a few times. There's, getting rid of the first copy of the Chalice will slow your opponent down quite a bit. And sometimes you kill a Zenon Obelisk, and sometimes you kill an opposing weapon when you play against opposing armory decks. So it's a pretty good card, and 4 power for 4 attack is not bad either, so it's a sizable threat as well. So and also carries weapons quite well. So yeah, one single copy is pretty good as a flexible answer. One copy of Navani. I'm just testing this card out. I don't know how great this card is. 4 power for 4/4 is a mediocre size body. It doesn't impact the board when it enters play. You have to swing with it, and as a 4/4, you often can't attack because your opponent will have enough things to block and kill it. So I'm not 100% sold on Navani here. I'm testing it out to see how it plays out when I do draw it. I've never found the need to tutor for it with Rise to the Challenge, so the only time I've ever played it was when I naturally drew it. And so far, it hasn't been super amazing. I'm not that impressed by it. I've only really managed to trigger its Warcry once or twice. And the problem with this is that even when you attack and it survives and you Warcry, you still have to wait until you draw another unit or weapon. And sometimes you just don't. Sometimes you draw a Torch, a Seek Power, you know, or something you can't play, or like you draw a Copperhawk Bailiff in turn 8 or 7 or 5 when a 3/4 isn't that much more relevant than a 2/3. So there's definitely some problems with this card. For Rise to the Challenge, because really I just want to search for Icaria most of the time, but Rise to the Challenge is very effective against control decks, especially Found Control, which is pretty popular these days. Being able to rise to the challenge for all your weapons is really good against that deck specifically. And then of course you can find your silver bullets for specific situations. If you need to get rid of something by silencing it, if you want to get rid of an attachment, if you are really desperate for health gain, you can get Throne Warden or Spirit Guide. If you're desperate for I don't know, against Stone Scar that has gone very wide with 10 tokens, 10 1/1 tokens in play, you can actually just search for the Copperhawk Bailiff, and that completely neutralizes their offense. Very versatile card in our deck. Deep Forge Plate is really good. You just slap it onto a lifelinker, a lifestealer, a flying unit, an Aegis unit, and the game ends very, very quickly. So just an overall very powerful card. Throne Warden has a really good synergies with the 4 weapons that we run in our deck. We only run 4 copies of weapons, but you can technically count it as 8 copies just because you can search for it when you need to. And having a high amount of armor with a decent weapon is really good because this serves as a repeatable removal spell. So if you can kill 2 or 3 of your opponent's units with a piece of weapon, then you've gotten a lot of card advantage, which is a huge problem for Rakano. These colors don't have a lot of cards that provide you with card advantage. In fact, I don't think there's any card that allows you to draw more cards with these 2 colors. So it's getting card advantage is a bit of a struggle. 1 copy of Daisho just because it's a pretty effective card at ending games against control decks, and being able to tutor for it means you have effectively 5 copies. Well, once it dies, then you're out, but yeah, it increases your likelihood of getting it when you need it. And then of course 4 copies of Icaria the Liberator. This card is pretty busty. This deck has a lot of decent targets for the +5/+5 Warcry trigger. And if you get it onto one of your weapons, then it really does just end games very quickly. If the +5/+5 Warcry trigger is on a Deep Forge Plate, a Daisho, or Runehammer, that'll allow you to kill pretty much anything your opponent has on the board. So very powerful. And I've already mentioned the Deep Forge Plate onto Icaria. It's not that big of a pipe dream actually. I've done it quite a few times with this deck. Surprisingly enough, it hits 7 power very regularly and usually in a timely fashion. So yeah, this deck is quite good. It's quite aggressive. It's very, very straightforward to play. Not a lot of complexities of decision making. You just play the things you can play and hope that your opponent runs out of removal spells when you play your big fatties and win the game off of that. I guess the only tricky part of playing this game is what happens in the early game. The ordering of the sequencing of your plays in the early game. What units do you play first? Whether or not you mentor. And then late in the game, the decisions are what to rise to the challenge for. So it does require you to have some knowledge of what's in your opponent's deck and knowing what cards are good against it. But overall, this is a fairly straightforward, fairly linear mid-range to mid to late aggro deck. So I'm gonna go ahead and record some video gameplay footage for you. This game We're currently said before 2/3 the 1/3 of the way in Diamond 1. So maybe if we can get 5, 6 wins in a row, we can get into Masters. Right? Thanks for watching.